Be'ezras Hashem, with Hashem's help, we begin today a new set of laws. Hilchos Pesulei Hamukdashin, the laws of holy entities, holy things, consecrated things that have become disqualified. Basically, the laws governing all types of sacrifices and things that are related to holiness, that something happens to them which makes them problematic. Some of these things we've already learned in previous laws. For example, how a blemished animal cannot be brought on the Mizbeach. Now we're going to learn in this set of laws, what do you actually do with such disqualified holy entities? The Rabbi once pointed out that the name of these halachas is very precise. Pesulei, it's disqualified only because it's mukdashin, only because we're dealing with a holy entity. That means that on a literal or more mundane level, all the disqualifications we're going to be discussing in these, basically the next 3 weeks, it's 19 chapters long, all of the disqualifications are not actually disqualifying factors for a regular thing. It's only because it's risen to a level of holiness that even these things disqualify it. And that's a lesson for us in life. First of all, in the Jewish people, there are those who have holier status, those who are chosen for more special missions, those who are chosen to be leaders and role models amongst the Jewish people. They're holy. And if you're holier amongst the people, even smaller things could be disqualifications for you. So the higher you are in the hierarchy or on the ladder of the Jewish people, the more careful you have to be with your actions. It also teaches us a flip side lesson. If you're not on that level and you're dealing with more mundane things, then actually for you, those very same things which the leaders could not do because of their status, you actually must do. It's part of your responsibility. Not only is it not a disqualifying factor for you, it actually is an enhancing factor for you. The Rabbi gives the example of somebody who has to work the field using the agricultural society of the time. The great people who are supposed to be sitting and studying Torah all day, it would be beneath them to deal with the outside world. But those who have to, and that's their occupation, to go out there and make their living by dealing with the world as it is in its earthy state, when they do that, they get what's called a shleimus. They get an even bigger completeness by doing and by dealing with those mundane things. So if God, we're not farmers, but if God sends your way a mission that it looks like it's beneath your dignity, it's too mundane for me to be dealing with, actually that might be your calling. If it were holy, then it would be disqualifying. But if it's in the mundane realms, go there. Do those things that other people might think is disqualifying. For you, it'll be what you need to do. It'll be fulfilling your purpose. As the Rambam always does, he gives us the list of mitzvahs which we're going to discuss in these laws. Yesh bichlalan shmeina mitzvahs. We have included in these laws the discussion related to 8 mitzvahs. Shtei mitzvahs aseh, v'sheish mitzvahs leis aseh, 2 positive, 6 negative, v'zehu pratan. These are their details. Aleph. It's forbidden to eat sacrificial meat from sacrifices that have become disqualified or were blemished. Beis shalei lechol pigul. It is forbidden to eat pigul. Pigul literally means disgusting, but it's a specific halachic reference to a sacrifice which was offered with improper intent. And we're going to have a lot of time to discuss what exactly constitutes improper intent. But at the core level, it basically means the Kohen, while he was doing one of the integral services of the sacrifice, he considered eating the meat of the sacrifice at the wrong time or in the wrong place. Or slaughtering a sacrifice that was supposed to be a peace offering, having in mind that you're doing a burnt offering, for example, switching the name of the sacrifice. Those are the basic ways to create pigul, the wrong intent, and if a sacrifice has the wrong intent accompanying it, the meat is forbidden to be eaten. Gimel shelo yoser kadashim la'achar zmanam. It's prohibited to leave purposely sacrificial meat after their time. We saw a couple of sets of laws ago that every single sacrifice has a time frame in which it could be eaten. Some have just that day and the following night. Some have 2 days and a night. You can't purposely leave it over past that time. Dalid, if you did, shelo yechal noiser. It's prohibited to eat noiser, leftover meat that's been gone beyond its time frame. Hey, shelo yechal kadashim shenitmu. It's forbidden to eat sacrifices that have become impure, ritually impure. Vav shelo yechal adam shenitma hakadashim. If a person becomes ritually impure, he shall not consume sacrificial meat. Zayin lisreif hanaiser. If we have meat left over beyond its specified time frame, we have to burn it. Ches as well, lisreif hatame. We have to burn sacrificial meat which became impure. The explanation of these mitzvahs is coming in the following 19 chapters. Perek Rishain, chapter 1. Just as a trivia fact, this chapter looks long, but it's not actually long. It has 37 halachas, one of the most in the entire Rambam. The most is in the laws of divorce. It's got 41 halachas. This one has 37, but because they're actually pretty much all short, the size of the chapter is not that big. So let's get right to it without further ado. Halacha Aleph, says the Rambam, Kol hapsulin la'avoda. This is a rule we actually learned before. Any Kohen or any person who is disqualified from doing service in the temple, a non-Kohen or a Kohen with a blemish, for example, mutarin lishchait kadashim lechatchila, is still allowed initially. In other words, they can be the first choice to slaughter sacrifices. Because shchita could be done even by a zar, even by a non-Kohen. Mafilu kadshe kadshim, even the holiest of holy sacrifices. Chutz min atameh, except for a Kohen who is ritually impure. She'eina sheichet lechatchila, such a person, even a non-Kohen. If you're impure, initially, you're not a first choice pick. You cannot slaughter sacrifices. Even though you're actually outside of the temple courtyard. Because the tameh person, at some levels, if you're on a lower level of ritual impurity, you just can't come into the temple courtyard. So even if you're standing outside, upashat yadav v'shachat ba'azara, and you would just stretch out your hand and slaughter in the azara, we're not going to let you do that on the first choice level. It's a decree. Perhaps you're going to touch the meat, make it impure, which is a big problem. If you transgress this impure person and nevertheless slaughtered, the offering is kosher. So the commentaries discuss at length how this is possible exactly. Because if we're talking about lighter level sacrifices, so fine, they could be slaughtered anywhere in the azara. So he can be standing at the outside of the azara, reaching his hand in, slaughtering an animal right there. But if we're talking about kadshe kadashim, as the Rambam mentioned in the beginning, part of the contrast is even the holiest of holy sacrifices. How could you ever have a ritually impure person slaughtering the holiest of holy sacrifices? The kadshe kadashim had to be slaughtered in the north, right over here, the northern area of the azara. How would they standing outside here be able to stretch their hand in? Big discussion in the commentaries. The Rebbe once suggested that it could be the person became impure in the temple courtyard. Earlier in this book, in the laws of Bias Hamukdash, the Rambam taught us that when somebody becomes ritually impure in the temple, they have an obligation to immediately find the fastest way out and take it. But if they do something on the way, something with no disruption, it's not a detour, they do some kind of service on their way out, it's okay. So perhaps we can consider a scenario where a Kohen was standing in the north, he became impure, some dead rodent touched him or whatever it is, so he begins heading out. On his way out, they hand him a knife, and because he's a lower level of ritual impurity, he won't transfer the impurity to the knife, and on his way walking, he slaughters the animal in the north. That would be the scenario that's possible, and if that's so, it teaches a very big lesson, mystically. Sometimes we become impure, not in the physical or ritual sense, just conceptually. Engage with something that impurifies us. Such a person had to leave the temple premises. But even on your way out, you can achieve shchita. Shchita mystically is called meshicha, it's elevation. On your way out, you can stop to help somebody else, so to speak. Even when you're on your own low, you can still achieve elevation by somebody else. Continuing back in the Rambam, b'chein. So too, par koyin gadol shel Yom Kippurim, the bull which belonged to the high priest on Yom Kippur. We'll have later in this book a small set of laws that goes through the service of Yom Kippur in the temple. And there we'll learn that the Kohen Gadol had to bring a special bull upon which he would recite a confessional prayer and then slaughter it. And ideally, he's supposed to slaughter it. Afal pishan emar ba, even though it says about this bull, v'shachat Aaron, Aaron should slaughter. Now actually, if you look in the verse, the words v'shachat Aaron don't appear together. It says v'hikriv Aaron, Aaron should bring close the bull that he has, recite a confessional prayer, v'shachat, and he should slaughter. So it's obvious that the object of the verb is Aaron the subject of the verb is Aaron because it says before, v'hikriv Aaron v'shachat. So it's v'shachat Aaron, and I'm kind of putting those two words together. Point is, even though the Torah clearly indicates that Aaron should be the one to slaughter it, im shchata zar kasher. If a non-Kohen slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, it's okay. Af para aduma sheshchata zar. Even the red heifer, which has a very special ceremony, the way it's offered outside of the temple, took it out on a special ramp. There was a whole place where they would do this special offering, and the Torah clearly says that the deputy Kohen Gadol is supposed to be the one to slaughter it. But if a non-Kohen slaughtered it, ksheira, it's kosher. She'ein lecha shchita psula b'zar. There's no such thing as a slaughtering of a sacrificial offering that is disqualified if a non-Kohen does it. At the end of the day, if a non-Kohen does it, it's always kosher. A person slaughtered a sacrifice. He didn't have intent for slaughtering. He was just busy with a knife, kind of going back and forth, and boom, an animal came. He was right in the temple courtyard, let's just say. For whatever reason, how exactly it happened is not relevant. Point is, he just slaughtered it, and he wasn't intending to do the act of shchita ela kimisasek. He was simply busying himself with the knife. That's disqualified. He has to have intent that he's doing shchita, slaughtering a sacrifice. When it comes to sacrifices, you should not slaughter two heads of different animals at once. After the fact, if you did so, it's kosher. On the flip side, you could have two people slaughtering one animal, sacrificial meat, like you would do for a regular animal. Regular animal, by the way, if you have a long enough knife, you could slaughter two heads at once. Only with sacrifices you shouldn't. A minor under bar mitzvah should not slaughter sacrifices, even though he's being supervised by an adult, which thereby makes regular shchita kosher if done by a minor and he's being supervised by an adult, but not for sacrifices. Sacrifices require proper intent, and minors, according to the rabbis, are not considered to be thoughtful enough to have this proper intent. Even if his thoughts were proven from his actions. We don't treat it as thoughtful intent to be lenient, only to be strict. What does that mean, Ketzat? That means we'll actually sometimes use his intent if it brings a disadvantage, but not if it brings an advantage, as the Rambam presently describes. You have an oila, a burnt offering, standing in the south area of the temple courtyard. An oila can only be slaughtered in the north area of the temple courtyard. Comes the kid. And the kid pulls the animal to the north, so it's clear what his intent is. He's obviously intending to slaughter a sacrifice. He knows you have to bring it to the north. He brings it to the north, ushchata, and slaughters it. From his actions, it's clear that he's intending to slaughter a sacrifice. It's still disqualified, because that would be following his intent, lehakil, to be lenient and to allow the shchita to go through. We're not going to follow it. Talking about the south, if the holy of holy sacrifices that was supposed to be slaughtered in the north was slaughtered in the south, or even if it was slaughtered in the proper place, but its blood was received on the south side of the Azara, psulin, it's disqualified. If you were standing in the south, stretched your hand out to the north and slaughtered the shchita is kosher. As long as the animal and the shchita was in the north, you're good. Only for slaughtering though, not for the blood. If you were standing in the south, stretched out your hand and received the blood in the north, the reception that you did is disqualified. In any scenario, if a Kohen puts in his head and most of his body into the north side of the Azara, he's considered to be standing in the north, and that's fine. The previous case is talking about where you stuck your hand out. But if you actually put your head and most of your body inside, it's like you're standing in the north. Consider this case where there's an animal in the north side of the Azara, slaughtered it properly on the right place, and it convulsed and left to the south. Every animal, after you slaughter it, makes some movements. Its final life coming out of it, and it jumped into the south. Even if you actively brought it to the south, moved it along as it was convulsing, it's kosher. The main slaughtering was done in the north, you're good. If it convulsed, went to the south, came back to the north, and you successfully received its blood in the north as well, that's also kosher. The same thing, all these last couple of scenarios that we just played out, when it came to the Holy of Holies between north and south, the same things apply when it comes to the lower level sacrifices between their area of slaughtering and not. In other words, anywhere in the temple courtyard versus outside. So the Rambam begins. Let's say there was lighter sacrifices. They were standing inside. You're standing outside. You put your hand inside and you slaughtered. So the same way when it came to slaughtering over here, crossing the boundary with your hand was okay. So too over here, it's kosher. On the other hand, if it was not the slaughtering, it was the receiving of the blood that you did in this position where the animal was inside the Azara, you put your hand in and received the blood, psula, your reception is disqualified. Here, even if you put your head and most of your body inside, when it comes to south and north, head and most of your body inside is good. Here, inside and outside temple courtyard, Even you put in your head and most of your body. Even if the Kohen doing the service was fully inside, just his tzitzis, a little strand was hanging outside. It's disqualified whatever he does. Because it says in the verse, when you come into the tent of meeting, you have to be coming fully inside. Once you're fully inside, between directions, you can put your head and most of your body counts for one way or the other. But to get in, you got to be fully in. Halacha Yud Gimel, Pirkasa Behema v'Yatzas Lachutz Achar Kabbalas Dama. Same thing here. If the animal convulsed, went outside after the blood was already received, Ksheira, it's kosher. Shafilu Yatzahu Imurin B'Habasar Kedem Zvika B'Kadashim Kalim Hazevach kosher. Even if the actual innards or the flesh of the sacrifice went out before it was the blood was sprinkled in later sacrifices, it's kosher. Kamishi is bar, as will be explained. So certainly, if the animal just stuck its leg out in a convulsion after the slaughtering and after the reception of the blood. Yudalid, the entire animal was inside. Its feet were outside and you slaughtered it as a bach, the sacrifice is disqualified. Because it says, you have to bring your sacrifices to God. That's the passage talking about not bringing sacrifices outside the temple. So it says you have to bring it to Hashem, which means it's got to be fully inside. If you slaughtered it, it was fully inside, then it sticks its leg outside. You have to do an emergency surgery. Chop the flesh till the bone, and only then receive the blood. If you were to receive the blood and then cut it, it would be disqualified because of the fat of the flesh that's outside, which may have passed through to the blood that you're receiving in your vessel, and you're getting blood from a part of a sacrifice that's outside. No good. If it was the lighter level sacrifices, no need to cut. Bring its foot back in and just receive the blood. As we just said before, lighter level sacrifices, even if the meat goes out of the temple courtyard, it's totally fine before sprinkling of the blood. Interesting case. Person has an animal, must be a small animal. He hangs it in the air and slaughters it in the air. It's not standing on the ground. Psula, it's disqualified because it says, Al Yerech HaMizbeach. It has to be on the side of the altar. Where's that verse? Oh, I didn't put it in here. Ad sheyishchet ba'aretz, that means you must slaughter it on the ground. Hoysa behema ba'aretz, v'nisla v'shachat v'hutali ba'avir. If the animal was on the ground, you lifted yourself up, hanging, and slaughtered while you're in the air, b'kachim kachim pasul, b'kachim kalim kosher. Holier sacrifices, disqualified. Lesser sacrifices, kosher. Yudches, shachat miut simanin b'chutz, ugmaran bifnim. You slaughtered part of the animal's pipes outside, but you finished them inside. According to halacha, it's not considered a full shechita till you slaughter, when it comes to an animal, most of its two pipes, windpipe and food pipe. So here you slaughtered a minority. You did what wouldn't be called the halachically significant shechita outside of the temple courtyard or outside of the proper place, and you finished it inside. Again, minimum in the holier sacrifices. Part of it in the south, finished it in the north, psulin, it's still disqualified. This is a very important rule. Even though it's only called a shechita once most of the pipes have been severed, the act of shechita is the entire duration from when you slit the neck till the pipes are slaughtered. The entire thing is called the act of shechita. So if any part of the act of shechita was done in an improper place, the whole act is disqualified. You're hanging in the air and you didn't slaughter. You just received the blood from the neck of an animal which is on the ground. Puzzle, it's disqualified. That's not a way to serve in the temple. You're standing in the temple courtyard. You hung the cup from your hand and you received the blood while it's hanging in the air. You're not actively holding on to the tool. Or after the slaughtering, you lifted the animal into the air and you receive the blood while it's in the air. Kosher, that's kosher. Sha'aver hamakim kamakim, because the airspace of a place is like a place for these laws. Chaf Aleph, nasan mizrak l'seich mizrak v'kibel. If a Kohen puts one cup into another cup and then receives it, here he's receiving the blood, he puts one cup into another. Kosher, that's kosher. Min b'minayin echaytzeitz, if it's two things or two implements of the same type are not considered an intervening substance. Hiniach siv b'seich mizrak v'kibel. What if you put some little ivy or palm bast inside the cup and you receive the blood? Kosher, that's kosher, because the bast is hollow. In the end of the day, the blood is going to reach the actual cup. There's no intervening substance. But if you did that when it comes to doing kmitza from the mincha offering, you put a little bast into your hand and then you pick the flour, psula that's disqualified because not necessarily will it be held by your hand. Halacha chaf beis, kabbalah sadam, receiving the blood, and walking it to the altar, uzrikasei, and sprinkling it, v'chein halacha sevadim lakevesh, and also the bringing of the limbs to the ramp of the mizbeach. These were very integral parts of the service of every sacrifice. All of these acts can only be performed with a Kohen who is fit to serve. As we explained when it came to doing kmitza, the 3 fingers full from the flour offering, and doing malika, the way to shecht, to slaughter a bird sacrifice. So while the slaughtering, the shchita, we began this chapter, that anybody can do it, even if you're disqualified for service, the rest of the stages of the sacrifice service can only be done with a Kohen. Walking the blood, bringing it to the mizbeach, so to speak, if not done by foot, is not called a proper walking. Lefichach, therefore, kohen, and we're going to go with the texts, because some texts do say it, kohen gadol, shekiba lesadam, ve'amad bimkoyma yuzrak el mizbeach. If a high priest received the blood, stood in his place, and just chucked the blood onto the altar from where he was without walking it by foot, nifsal hazevach, the entire sacrifice has become disqualified. And the commentaries deal with this halacha. First of all, why is the Rambam repeating himself? I mean, if you just said, if you don't walk it by foot, it's not called walking. Why do we have to have the descriptive lefichach? And even there, why choose a case of a high priest and not a regular priest? So the Rebbe once explained that the Rambam is communicating a double stringency. First of all, the general rule. You have to walk the blood to the mizbeach after receiving it by foot. Then consider the following. There could be a scenario where you won't have to do that. Let's say you slaughter the animal right next to the altar. You wouldn't have to walk it because you're right there. Nevertheless, the Rambam's simple language implies that that's also disqualified. That's the Rambam's first line. In any case, even if because of the placement or the location, there wouldn't be a need to walk, you still have to actively walk with your foot. To that, the Rambam adds that the same can be said about a person. Even if you have a person who usually looks to do the shortest route of things, and that was the high priest. We see in many cases, we do the most to not inconvenience him. So one would think that the Kohen Gadol, who is a person whose status demands not having to do a halacha beregel, he could stand in place and just throw the blood onto the mizbeach. Says the Rambam, no, the same way when it's location concerned. It doesn't make a difference. You must always walk it with your foot. So too, when it's person concerned, it doesn't make a difference who you are. You must always walk it by foot. A person the Kohen received the blood in his right hand, as he should, and passed it to his left. Put it back to your right. If you received the blood in a cup that wasn't holy, an unholy utensil, the whole sacrifice is disqualified. If you received it in a holy utensil, put it into an unholy utensil, just pass it back to a holy utensil. If part of the blood spilled from the utensil that you were using onto the floor and you gathered it in, kosher, that's kosher. But if all the blood spilled to the floor, from the neck of the animal straight, and then you picked it up from the floor into the vessel, that was never in the vessel at one point, nifsal hazevach, the whole sacrifice is disqualified. Part of the blood spurted out from the neck of the animal onto the ground, and you didn't gather that one. And then more blood came out. You took more blood from the animal's neck. That's kosher. So long as the blood that you're receiving now is part of what's called the lifeblood, still spurting out in strong spurts. Not the concentrated blood that's in the limbs and kind of just spills out later, nor the blood coming from the hide. Any sacrifice whose blood was received by a person who's disqualified from service in the temple, or they walked the blood to the mizbeach, or they sprinkled it, even if they did it all right, but they weren't fit for service, nifsal hazevach, the sacrifice is disqualified. These three things must be done with a Kohen fit for service. Kibel hakosher v'nasan lapasol. If a kosher Kohen received the blood, he handed it off to a disqualified person or Kohen. That guy didn't do anything. He didn't move. Stood in place. Yachzel kosher, you can pass it back to a kosher person who will finish the procedures. But if a person who was disqualified for service just walked with the blood a tiny bit, and passed it back to a kosher kohen who finished the walk, or the kosher kohen walked it a little bit first, and then passed it off to a person who was disqualified who also walked with it a little bit. Since the bottom line is somebody disqualified walked the blood a little bit, beginning or the end, the sacrifice is disqualified. This cannot be corrected. If a disqualified kohen received the blood. So when it comes to walking, if you think about it, once he did a walk, you can't walk that back, no pun intended. But if the disqualified person just received the blood, if there's still some lifeblood left, get a kosher guy to finish receiving the blood, let him walk it and sprinkle it, and all will be fine. The fact that the disqualified person for service received the blood doesn't make the rest of the blood considered left over and disqualified. Except for a ritually impure kohen. Since technically he could serve. In one scenario, if the sacrifice is offered in a state of impurity, because most of the Jewish people are impure, or most of the kohenim are impure, there's a scenario where impure kohen could actually serve. As we explained, so if he were to receive the blood, he converts the rest of the blood into leftover and can no longer be used in receiving of the blood. Ketzad, what does that mean? Kibel hatame, if a ritually impure kohen received the blood. Afal pisha kibel acharav hakosher, dam hanefesh uzrakai, even if afterwards a kosher kohen went and took actual lifeblood and sprinkled it, nifsal hazevach, the sacrifice was disqualified. Shezesha kibel hakosher ba'achreina shirayim uvein neklum, because the blood that was received by the kosher kohen later is considered leftover, relative to the blood that was received by the impure kohen, and it's nothing therefore. Chavtes behema shechasar me'evarei kolshu. If an animal lost one of its limbs, even the tiniest amount, after the slaughtering, before the receiving of the blood. The moment of slaughter, it lost part of its leg. Nifsala, it's disqualified. Even if the kohen, by mistake, he's kind of going with a knife and he grazes the ear of the animal, chops off part of the ear before the kohen receives the blood. He shouldn't even bother receiving it. Because it says, V'lokach midam hapar. Where is it? Here. He must take from the blood of the bull. When you take the blood, it has to be a full bull. So to any other animal, a full animal. If you were to receive the blood from an animal which is missing a limb and you still went and sprinkled it, disqualified. But if it was only lost part of its limb, after the receiving of the blood, before it was sprinkled, even if the whole meat was lost or burnt before sprinkling the blood, if even an olive-sized portion remains from the meat or the parts that are going to be sacrificed, you can sprinkle the blood. If there isn't even an olive-sized portion, don't sprinkle it. If it's a burnt offering, which anyways the entire thing is going on to the Mizbeach, even if you have two halves, half of an olive-sized portion of the meat, half of an olive-sized portion of the parts that are usually sacrificed in other sacrifices, can combine to an olive-sized portion and allow for the sprinkling of the blood to take place. Because it's all going to the fire. In the previous case of, let's say, a peace offering, so the meat is the part that's going to be eaten, and the imurim are the part that are going to be offered. So each one, since its own unit, has to have its own kazayas. But here, where it's all going to be burnt, even a combination is fine. Lamed aleph nishar pachas mikazayas la yizraik. In the case where there's less than an olive-sized portion, again, you shouldn't sprinkle the blood. V'im zarak lehurtza. If you did, it doesn't achieve anything. Nifsal habasar kreidem zrika sheyatza chutz la'azara. If the problem was not that the flesh or the meat was burnt or lost, it just became disqualified. Something bad happened to it, or it left the temple courtyard premises. La yizrek hadam v'im zarak hurtza. You also shouldn't sprinkle the blood, but in this case, if you did, it does achieve atonement. Lamed beis psar kachim kalim sheyatza chutz la'azara kreidem zrikas damim. We mentioned this before. This is where the Rambam explains it. Meat of the lesser level holy sacrifice that left the temple premises before the sprinkling of the blood, afal pisha nizra kadam b'habasar b'chutz. Even if the blood was sprinkled while the meat is still outside, hazevach kosher, the meat, the sacrifice is kosher, because anyways, kachim kalim can be eaten in all of Jerusalem. So anyways, the meat's going to leave the temple premises. So if we're left now, what's the problem? However, in this case, while the sacrifice is kosher, the sprinkling only achieves enough to allow it to be burnt, but not to allow it to be eaten, because it did leave before the proper time, so you shouldn't eat it. Same thing if you have the parts that are supposed to be sacrificed, not the parts that are supposed to be eaten from these peace offerings or other lower level sacrifices, if they left the temple premises before sprinkling the blood. And the blood was sprinkled while they were outside, the sacrifice hasn't become disqualified, it's still kosher. And if you bring them back, you can still offer them on the altar. And even if you didn't bring them back, if you partake of them, and they're pigul, they had the improper intent, or they're left over past their time frame, or they're ritually impure, you'd be liable on their account, even though they left at a time that they shouldn't have left. All individual sacrifices, whether the meat or the fats became ritually impure and the other unit was still extant, you can still sprinkle the blood. And if they both become impure, don't sprinkle ideally, but if you did, there's atonement. Because the tzitz, the fact that the Kohen Gadol wore the golden headplate, would achieve atonement. That's what it's for. In cases where there was some ritually impurifying disqualifier, and you still brought the sacrifice, the tzitz achieves atonement for that. And also if you have innards of a regular sacrifice or limbs of a burnt offering that became impure and you still offered them, the fact that the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz achieves atonement for that. But if it's a communal sacrifice and all the meat and all the fats became ritually impure, you should still sprinkle the blood on the altar. If blood of a sacrifice left the temple premises, the whole sacrifice is disqualified. Even if you gathered it up later and sprinkled it on the altar, it doesn't become atoned. Another unique rule relevant to sacrificial blood, it does not contract impurity. Usually, there are 7 liquids that are called liquid according to halacha. One of them is blood. Blood of sacrifices is not susceptible to impurity. Because about blood it says, Al ha'aretz tishpechenu kamayim. You must spill it on the ground like water. Which means, dam shenishpach kamayim, hu hanechshav kamayim u'mekabel tuma. Only blood which could be spilled like water is considered like water and susceptible to impurity. Aval dam kadashim, but sacrificial blood, she'ene nishpach kamayim, you don't spill it like water, you must sprinkle it on the mizbeach, you have a special way to treat it. Eine mekabel tuma, it doesn't become susceptible to ritual impurity. Lamed zayin, v'dam sheshakal of cham avalei nizrak, blood from a sacrifice, which was supposed to be offered that day. And the sun set and you hadn't yet sprinkled it, nifsal hazevach, the whole sacrifice is disqualified. Even if you sprinkle it later, the atonement is not achieved. You must bring another sacrifice.